From Amaya Media, you're listening to Tales of the Trade, conversations with pioneers from our region and the stories behind the communities they are bringing to life. I'm Chirag Desai. And on today's episode, Ramsey Tesdell tells me about his entrepreneurial journey building podcasting powerhouse Sowt and the importance of working on yourself as a leader.
You're probably a Reddit geek like I am, but I spend some time on Reddit and there's these posts that I love, right? It's like a post that's like, "Hey, 40-year-olds, what is one thing that you would tell your 20-year-old self what you would do?" It's all like take care of your back, take care of your teeth. But one of them was, start working on yourself earlier in small pieces, because we go through education, like we learn a lot and there's all this development. We're growing really quickly. And then we get into our career and our professions, and there isn't that intentional growth. And so this is something that I personally wish I had done earlier and done more of earlier. And so, what's the best way to mitigate that or to make up for that is instituted in the culture of the organization.
Ramsey Tesdell is the co-founder of Sowt, the independent podcast company based in Jordan. Now, the company itself started out as a social networking platform, and in 2017, Ramsey got together with his two co-founders to lead their pivot into podcast network. Today, Sowt produces more than 50 shows, partners with local and international organizations, and has led the two regional acquisitions in the podcast space. Now, this was our second episode together. 3 years ago, Ramsey joined me and another podcaster, Lucas Krobat, hey Lucas, for a live episode on Twitter Spaces to talk about the impact of Apple Podcast subscriptions. I'll leave you a link in our show notes if you want to see how accurate our predictions were. But let's dig into Ramsey's entrepreneurial journey and his early influences growing up in the US.
Although I've rejected that label many, many times over and over again, I guess I would be considered like a third culture kid. But I think, I did most of my schooling, all my schooling in the US. And then in 2006, the stars aligned in some way to come to Jordan and spend a bunch of time here.
I heard you say recently that you came back to kind of explore your identity. Was it just that or was it something else?
I mean, I always use the language like I came back to Jordan, but it was like really the first time I'd been here, the first time I arrived on my own by myself without, my mother or like someone telling me what to do and where to go and who to say hi to and what food to eat
So
and
basically,
whatnot.
as an adult.
As an adult, sort of. Physically, maybe an adult, but maybe not maturity as an adult. And then, 18 years, 17 and a half years later, here we are, still in Jordan. And this is home, and we have a house and a family and kids and all kinds of a sick cat. Poor cat is sick. He's getting hopefully better. But then the second part of your question, I come from a family of academics,
Okay.
whether like PhD doctors and university academics or just like teachers, educators, all the way from like teaching English as a second language to like younger school kids, on both sides, on a lot of my family actually are mostly educators. My brother, my father, my mother, in many ways, my aunts, uncles. So I was steeped in that like kind of culture, and I think what's interesting about that is education. The flip side of education is curiosity, I think, and so being curious, I think that kind of helped, my brother and I and the people around us to be curious, and I think that's a really important trait to have.
Let's also trace a little bit about South's journey, right? So it was just an organic sort of foray into saying, here's an opportunity and I want to take it? Or was it, I want to break from what I was doing up to now and I want to, go do my own thing, which is, again, I mean, there's no wrong answer, so to speak, because everybody has a different path to it, but I'm
Yeah.
curious yours is.
I mean, I was definitely, as a child, was always trying to do the opposite of what my brother was doing or the opposite of what my family was doing, for sure. Like that was definitely part of it. But I don't think this was like an intentional step away from what other people were doing. And in some ways, actually, until maybe quite recently, I wouldn't really have considered myself an entrepreneur. I wouldn't really have considered myself, someone who's actually building a business.
What changed it for you?
Yeah, maybe I just admitted to myself that I was actually, building a business that was, unintentionally maybe semi-successful. It's like, oh my gosh. this thing is growing and it keeps growing. Maybe we need to get serious about this. So definitely, in a lot of ways, a lot of it was unintentional. And it was interesting, I was talking to a marketing person recently. I was like, okay, we need to increase our marketing, we need to grow our audiences by X amount, and all these things. And he was like, well, you have a big audience. And I was like, yeah, but it needs to be bigger. And he was like, Salt already has what a lot of people are trying to get. And what that is organic reach. He's like, that's fantastic. And so I was like, okay, but now I want inorganic reach. So make this grow, but it's a great place to start from, because we focused on creating content in a way that not a lot of people were. And we focused on creating content from a perspective that, wasn't really out there. And so that's kind of, where we filled some gaps, or, kind of carved out a little bit of a niche there.
Now, I know podcasts seem very mainstream these days, but we're actually building on a 2 decade history. We can trace the origins of the medium to the year 2000, even though the word podcast itself wasn't coined until 2004. Of course, the launch of Serial in 2014 was a big takeoff point, and it's been an absolute whirlwind since 2019 when Spotify set up a number of high ticket acquisitions. In the region, though, the larger podcasting ecosystem was just about beginning to take shape in 2017 when Sowt was getting started. In fact, it was around the same time that the first building blocks for Finyal Media were coming together. And by then, Ramsey had already had his first taste of entrepreneurship.
It was like a media website, it was like a journalism independent media website, and that's still going, and I'm really happy to see that like grow and like flourish
Sure.
beyond me. I had wanted to move into audio for several different reasons. I like it. I listen to it a lot. Grew up listening, to NPR and a lot of the good radio in the US. And so I always looked to, model that in some way. And so and really, it was just kind of random chance. A friend of mine, had a company that was like the original Twitter, which was like an audio social network, right? And so they were sending around audio messages back and forth. This was before the days of voice notes. Where now voice notes are, integral part of our society, whether we like them or not.
Very much so.
And it was still awkward to hear your voice and send your voice to someone else on a short message and whatnot. So, they didn't have the traction that they wanted. They were growing, they were doing okay, but it wasn't quite where they wanted. And so when I came along and was like, oh, this could be really interesting to, pivot or to move towards podcasts, they loved the idea. And so basically, we came up with a scheme that would, as we hit certain targets and grew in certain ways, I would become a bigger partner, and then we leveled out at a certain place that I'm a partner with three other people basically. They are fantastic partners in that sense that they're extremely supportive. They don't get involved in details that too many cooks in the kitchen and whatnot. And we have a fantastic relationship, and I think that's probably one of the reasons that we've been successful is that, we have a really good working relationship with each other. And so Sot has, from that, random kind of meeting as friends to discuss this to, now we're 30 plus, full-time employees. We have probably 40 or maybe even 50 kind of original podcasts now with the latest acquisition. And, as many or more client or kind of branded studio uh, podcasts as well. And so, yeah, things have really taken off, and it's been interesting to see that journey. And being a part of it, you don't always recognize it, right?
Yeah.
You're a founder, you're a entrepreneur, you're building stuff. We're builders, right? And so sometimes you have to take that moment and stop and like, whoa, did we do all that? That's pretty amazing.
Actually, conversations like this is when I can stop and be like, oh, yeah, okay, yes, also yes.
Right.
Is there a specific moment maybe when you looked at it that you said, okay, yes, now we are here, or now we've arrived, or now this is working? Because I think that's one of the things, at least I know, again, from a building point of view, you don't really notice, right? When you're in the moment, you're just like, okay, next thing, next thing, next thing, next thing.
Man, the journey building has been so intense, and it started right around, my first, like when we had our first kid, when our first child came. And it was interesting because, I made a very risky move to, leave a full-time well-paying job to, take peanuts basically for a couple of years to get this thing going. With the idea at some point, hopefully that, it will make that back and more.
Yeah, yeah.
There isn't necessarily like one big moment, and I think you're right. Like this idea of taking a moment to reflect, when you're speaking to someone like another founder, another builder, or if you're in an interview or on a panel, sometimes I have these moments where I'm like reflecting and whatnot. But I did have a specific moment where I was like, oh, I have this project, and they kind of just looked at me and they were like, this is not a project. This is a company with
Yeah,
like revenue and like shows, and people look to it for, information and whatnot. And so I think that was a moment in a lot of sense, which was maybe like 3 years ago during the pandemic, maybe, where it was like, okay, no, this is much more serious than I was kind of, still thinking of it as like a little thing that I was doing.
fun thing that you were doing in a project. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in the last like 2 or 3 years, there's been a collection of moments,
Mm.
talking to an investor, talking to, these like the Media Development Investment Fund, that have financed some of our work over the last couple of years, and some other things, and those, when explaining kind of what we do and where we've achieved, and I also think, looking at other people's numbers and seeing other people's numbers and looking into other companies and the mergers and acquisitions, I think, are kind of an interesting strategy because you get to see a lot of information, right?
Yeah, of course.
Which is very interesting because we hold these things very tightly to our companies, and so seeing that and seeing where you are compared to that is, I think, is very interesting. And generally, what we've seen is that we're bigger, we do more than a lot of the people that we kind of considered our peers. And so that's been kind of interesting to see that kind of strategy have kind of byproducts like that. And then you can always compare it to things that are bigger and better, right? And I always tell my team, like, again, we had like an HR issue and we handled it really well, and everybody's kind of like, oh, that was great and whatnot. And I was like, yeah, that's really great if you compare ourselves to, us or below us, but compare yourself to something above, bigger, better. It doesn't have to necessarily be bigger, but more professional,
Yeah,
more ethical.
or at least where you'd like to be, right? So
Right,
so
the ideal state, not the current state or whatnot. So, there's that, and there's always that trick to try to keep people, including yourself, to push forward and not, be okay with the status quo. I also just want to like say I'm not one of those people that is like we have to grow for growth's sake, and if you're not growing, you're dying. And it's not about that for me so much. But there is this excitement about growing and developing and changing, and that is very attractive.
yeah. By the way, I think it's a balance as well, right? I think it's
Right.
yeah. There are a lot of times when you want to look at the, as we just called it, the ideal state, right? Like you want to look at where you want to be and how things should operate in there and what you can do to move the pieces in that direction. But I think sometimes it's also good to just stop for a moment and just say, like, hey, considering everything, like this was a really good outcome.
Right.
Because otherwise, it's you're. I mean, it's like a hamster wheel, right? It never ends.
Yeah. I think it's been important for us too on a team level, to institute that, to celebrate,
Yeah.
like when we actually instituted this policy when we finish a season, we celebrate it as a team. When a show pushes out its last episode, for that season, we post, we share, we get excited, and we celebrate that. And that's really helped celebrate those moments. So,
You just mentioned now, right? Like that. Now that you have all this insight, you realize you're bigger. You're doing more things and stuff. What would you attribute that to? Like, what do you think is the reason for it?
last at the beginning of last year, I think a lot of us kind of thought that last year was going to be a hard year for some reason.
Mhm.
And there are going to be companies and podcasts that don't make it through this year. And I think it was quite accurate in a different ways. And I think, you know, the economics are difficult of podcasts. So if you're not really passionate about it, if you don't really care about the content and the work that you're doing, there are other things that you can do that are more financially, uh, you know, uh,
Viable. Yeah,
exciting.
exciting. That's better.
like basically anything else, right? So you were like investment banking. I was like, you could sell tea, man, and it would probably be a better profit margin. But I think the economic situation, kind of the macroeconomic situation, was challenging. And also, I think, there's a core belief in that content. And this is something that I've been kind of thinking about a lot recently too, that, the podcasting is built on a free and open technology, right? It's RSS. Um, that is not owned by any, tech company. And this idea of like wherever you get your podcast is actually quite interesting to kind of investigate and think about. And so I think that aspect is really important. And also, as we see the damage that social media has done to our societies, that having alternative forms of media that's social or more social than news and whatnot as a productive way to have a conversation, I think is really, really important. And so if you have those kind of values, at your base, and that's what motivates you. And then what I said, too, then it needs to be successful, and you can define success in different ways. But, for us, it's reaching a lot of people and making money from it. If you kind of hold those things and that's what drives you, hopefully you can survive economically and production wise. And I think the other thing that we really respect and value content and the people who create that content. And I think that's been really important as well. People respect that. And, the two deals that we've done, acquisitions, like that has been one of the main reasons that those deals even got started, because people saw that respect for the content and they wanted their content to go to a place that would be respected. So I think that's really important.
Now, I spoke to Ramsey for a little bit longer on the state of the podcast industry, and you'll find that on a bonus episode that will be available to subscribers tomorrow and to everyone else next week. So you can support us and get the episode tomorrow by subscribing in Apple Podcasts or heading on over to talesofthe.trade to have a listen. As part of their growth strategy, Sowt acquired 2 podcast companies in the region, Finyal Media in 2022 and Rising Giants Network last year. We'll be digging into those acquisitions right after the short break. Stay with us.
Hi, I'm Hashim Montasser, and I describe myself as a raconteur and a well-traveled gourmand. Since launching our podcast, The Lighthouse Conversations, in 2019, we've had so many pivotal moments on our show, from heartfelt advice by world-class entrepreneurs like Fadi Ghandour.
When you have a culture of layoffs, your people that stick around are not going to be happy people. They might tell you they're happy that you didn't lay them off, but bull, I don't buy that.
Guests signaling Dubai's arrival on the world culture scene, like Dubai Tourism CEO Assam Khadim.
So there are 2-3 big brands that have come across recently, and also working within our teams across the world from international tourism perspective side of things, bringing the right journalists, bloggers, writers to talk about the food scene in Dubai in a much bigger way.
An hilarious moment that you can't script even if you wanted to, like the wonderful founders of Bogja, Huda Baroudi and Maria Hibri. Obviously, we're getting a lot of press.
Are you like an old couple who always,
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, but it's fun. It's fun. Yeah.
Okay.
But it's like an old couple, but it's not old as in age, old as in you've been together for a long time. But it's dysfunctional just enough for it to be fun. Yeah, it's not dysfunctional where it's like,
Get out of here.
Yeah, get out of here. The energy is good.
You need counseling.
It's just a little bit of the dysfunction that you need in a couple, which I love. But the relationship is fine. Our goal with the show is to showcase and celebrate the journey of pioneers in and around the Arab world, their highs and lows, so to speak, and how they got to where they did. We're excited to bring you shows full of interesting guests, stimulating conversations, and little nuggets that would hopefully make you gasp with delight. You can follow The Lighthouse Conversation on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon, and Rami, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow us on Instagram at @thelighthouse_podcasts for behind-the-scenes videos and more.
Welcome back to Tales of the Trade. I'm Chirag Desai. In 2022, Sowt announced their first acquisition, that of Dubai-based Finyal Media. This was also the first acquisition in the podcast space in the region, but it's no longer the only one. Sowt went on to acquire the Dubai-based Rising Giants network late last year.
I think acquisitions are interesting because each one is different, right? It's like having children. Each child, like, the first child, you think you're the best parent, you've figured everything out. By the time you figure it out, the kid has changed. Um, and you realize that actually, when the second kid comes around, that the second kid's so different than the first kid that everything you learned from the first kid, you're gonna have to throw out the window and relearn everything again.
Fair enough.
That was kind of my experience, at least, that, with Finyal specifically, Layla and I would touch base, every couple of months. So we would chat, we would, share notes, compare notes, talk about ideas and strategies. We were different enough that I don't think there was enough competition at the beginning to feel, to feel uncomfortable sharing information. And that relationship, we just kind of built over time. And so when, the opportunity arose, we had that kind of base to build on
Sure.
from. And so with Finyal, I think too, it was difficult in the sense that the content was quite different, fiction content, stories that we weren't used to telling in that way and whatnot. So there was that kind of element. With the second one with Rising Giants, it came in a similar way. Basil and I chat every once in a while. We compare notes. We were talking and seeing what was going on and seeing where opportunities existed to work together. I've been saying for years now that there needs to be more consolidation. And I think, that strategy has proven, for us at least, has been proven fruitful. With both acquisitions, we didn't actually absorb the teams. And so we didn't add a bunch of people. But what we did add, and to the detriment of my team mostly, is that we added a bunch more work all of a sudden.
Yeah, I was going to ask you. Sorry, I actually thought that in the case of with Rising Giants that you did bring on some of the team. That's how I understood that.
Yeah,
You brought
no,
on the content, the audience, all of that stuff, but not the team.
right, exactly. They were essentially like content IP arrangements where all the IP and the content and the talent relationships and whatnot were
Sure.
all moved over to Salt. And so we're still in that process with Rising Giants. They've got some fantastic content creators and talent that they're working with. And, I've already, spoken to most of them and had great conversations with all of them. And I think this is where too, values common values are probably needed across, companies that will merge. I mean, I think consolidation generally is can be a good thing, and I think in our part of the world, in our industry, it probably is a bit more. We probably need a bit more of that as we go. But I think these are two deals that have been really fruitful for us, and I think fruitful for the founders, the builders of the companies, and we're really excited about where that will go next. So
I mean, I know the Rising Giants one is still in progress, but maybe you can tell me maybe a couple of lessons that you learned from the Finyal acquisition that were interesting to you, or maybe perhaps unexpected.
for me, I'm a pretty open person. Really like to have my team know what's going on and be a part of that conversation. I think for me, it was really tricky to know how much to talk about when and to whom. Who needs to know, how much do they need to know? And I think with the Finyal one, that was harder and maybe a bit more sudden for people,
Right.
because that was kept pretty quiet, and only a couple people knew, and no one else really knew until basically we were done with the transaction. With the Rising Giants, I brought in, based on that, maybe mistake, that lesson. I brought in more people earlier, and got a lot more feedback on that, and I think that was smoother. It seems to have been better. And I think being in the position of doing it a second time, you kind of know what is happening, even though, it's a new child. But you feel like, at least I felt, I've been through this like once, like nothing can scare me now, and so when issues arise, which they always do, right? You're more equipped to handle them. So it felt a bit more comfortable the second time around.
So to wrap up, just a couple of quick questions for you. So one is there something you would have liked to know when you started that you know now?
I wish I would have, last year I spent a lot of time working on myself as a leader, working on myself, being able to listen better, have clear decisions, communicating better, some of these things as we mature, as an organization and as individuals. And so I wish I would have started that earlier. I definitely, this idea actually you're probably a Reddit geek like I am, but I spend some time on Reddit and there's these posts that I love, right? It's like a post that's like, hey, 40-year-olds, what is one thing that you would tell your 20-year-old self? What you would do, it's all like take care of your back, take care of your teeth,
Sure.
like it's random, start saving for retirement, 20 years ago, whatever. But one of them was, start working on yourself, in earlier in small pieces, because we go through education, like we learn a lot and there's all this development. We're growing really quickly. And then we get into our career and our professions, and there isn't that intentional growth. And so this is something that I personally wish I had done earlier and done more of earlier. And so what's the best way to mitigate that or to make up for that is instituted in the culture of the organization. So, we try to do that in different ways to encourage people to keep working on themselves. We're only as strong as, the individuals collectively. And so the stronger the individuals, the smarter, the faster, the more efficient, the more measured, better decision making, the better we are as an organization. And so I really, if I could go tell my 20-year-old self something, that would probably be that. And buy Bitcoin. No, just kidding.
I wonder if my 20-year-old self would take that on. I'm sure somebody told me that, by the way, but that doesn't automatically mean that I took it, right? And in fact, it's hilarious, right? Over the last year, the number of times I've told my parents that I'm turning into them, but in a good way. Versus 10 years ago, where I would say it out of frustration to be like, oh my God, I can't believe like I'm doing
Right.
this.
Yeah.
But today it's like, oh, I get it, right? Like I get why you were doing this.
Yeah.
So I think it's tricky. I think it's very tricky to be able to tell your 20-year-old self
Yeah.
that do something, because I don't know if I would have listened to it.
Right. That's a really good point. Would I have listened to myself, because in theory that person was probably my father or my mother, or, someone being like, keep working on yourself. And you're like,
Yeah,
whatever,
exactly.
I'm having a good time. So no, but I think also, on a bigger level, like in the region, there's been examples of good leadership and there's been examples of bad leadership. And I think, in specific issues that I'm very interested in, I've always been very worried about the leadership and what comes next and how that happens, on a political, economic, social, religious level this leadership. And I recently, was able to visit South Africa and have like a very deep look at apartheid and how that was picked apart. And part of that was a very intentional core group of leaders that were developed, that were, built over time, and it was intentionally worked on. And I think this is where that intentionality is really important in us and in our organizations. And so, maybe I wouldn't have my 20-year-old self wouldn't have listened to my 40-year-old self, but at least I can institute that in my organization and say,
Absolutely.
guys, everyone needs to do one thing every year that is for your own self development, for yourself to grow as a person, as an individual. It can be creative, it can be leadership, it can be in your technical area, but everybody's going to do one thing for themselves to develop. And so, that's one nice thing about being the boss is you can actually enforce that across all different levels. So I'm an unintentional and uncomfortable leader, but I've learned to be okay with being uncomfortable and trying to be better at it instead of ignoring it.
Is there something you would like to ask another entrepreneur?
I don't necessarily have something that I would ask another, but I enjoy being in conversation with, and I kind of, all the questions that you asked me, I kind of want to ask you now, and how did you deal with this? What would you learn? What did you learn from this that you wouldn't do again? What did you do that you would do again? And I feel like being in conversation with people in our industry and other entrepreneurs outside of our industry is really important. And I think having, I've had this advisory board over the last couple of years, and they've been really beneficial to me. I've gone to them when I've hit the wall, when I'm too tired to think about, this really important thing. And also my co-founders, I have to make sure that I thank them, constantly and thoroughly, because they really have helped do that. So I think being in conversation with many people, younger, older, same industry, different industries, is really useful. Yeah, so I don't really have a question, I guess, but why did you do it?
Why did I start this?
Why did you torture yourself, Sharon?
I think for me, obviously, like you, I was listening to podcasts for quite some time before I started one. And I think that there is so much value in that. I want to open up these conversations, and not everything can be opened up today, and it's going to be a gradual process.
Yeah.
But I think that's what the foundation needs to be, or that's what I want it to be, which is to say, how can I open up these conversations?
Yeah, that's
as long
great.
as everybody comes to the table honestly and with integrity, and then says, okay, let's have a good conversation, and that's the focus. That's a good starting point for me, I think.
Right.
So and then it's tomorrow and day after that we can develop that deeper and take it to another level and do something else with it.
No, that's lovely. I love that. And it's interesting to see like two podcast people talk to each other, not necessarily like obviously about podcasting in the industry, but I recently listened to an episode with On Being, Krista Tippett,
Yes.
who interviews Guy Raz, who's, does a billion amazing shows and
Lots of
whatnot.
shows now.
Yeah, and like kids shows and all this other stuff. But listening to them talk to each other was really fascinating, because neither are like, they're both used to asking the questions,
Mhm.
and it was interesting kind of hearing them talk about that. And it was very fruitful, to be honest. I really enjoyed it.
How do you go about striking sort of a work-life balance?
I've always struggled, and I was just thinking the other day, where most like important thinking happens in the shower. I was like, I wonder what it feels like to be an employee and not have to like worry about all the stuff that I have to worry about all the time. Because I've actually just other than like a year and a half of my life, I've never actually been an employee. Yeah, man, it's been, I don't know, the balance. To be honest, with kids, you don't have a lot of choices, and I actually have to leave. I have to end and leave in a few minutes because of that exact thing. But it's really important, I think, to keep that balance. And I think, having that longer perspective of time, I have a fantastic partner who really helps me, think through that, and be we're very supportive of each other, and she's very busy and works remote, and I'm very busy, and we sort of have an office and whatnot, so we help each other balance that. But I do find the flexibility to be one of the most valuable things of being the leader of my organization, and the one of the co-founders. And I cherish that, especially now with like younger children, and I want to be there for them. So I can kind of decide when I want to travel or when I don't want to travel, how much time to be in the office or not. And I've been very privileged and thankful for being able to be with them, with my two daughters and my partner a lot. So I really appreciate that.
It's funny, right? I was just sort of getting into the headspace for our conversation today, and that was kind of the recurring thought in my head, that like this has to be more frequent than this. But I think the other side of it is also just, I think there's so much value to be had in just having that chat, but not necessarily only privately, right?
I have a couple of like monthly calls with other media people. And we've also kind of chatted about making those, recording and whatnot, because they're very, very interesting. But I actually like the private nature of that. I think private and public.
No, of course. I mean, no, of course.
And I would love to speak to you more, often.
We should do that.
Than once every 3 years or whatever it is.
Yeah, definitely not once every 3 years. I agree. That was my conversation with Ramsey Tesdell, co-founder of podcast company Sowt. If you'd like to hear more about our thoughts on the podcast landscape, you can catch our bonus episode tomorrow by subscribing now, or get it next week with everyone else. Tales of the Trade is brought to you by Finyal Media. I'm Chirag Desai. See you again soon.